In this module, we will be discussing supply chain design and management. So a supply chain is the interrelated series of processes within an organization and across different organizations. Now that's important, across different organizations, not just within the organization, that lead to the production of a good or service that creates value. So let's look at a chocolate company to illustrate the concept of supply chain. First, a quick bit of background. In 2006, I made the switch from Kenwood commercial radio sales reps to chocolate. The name of the company was Utah Truffles, and it was a boutique chocolate company started by Keith and his wife 10 years earlier. So Keith had started producing the chocolates on the side, not as his primary job, but in his home kitchen for small clientele that used the chocolates for gifts during the holidays. As demand began to grow, he decided to quit his job, lease a permanent space, and purchase some equipment. I call this the curse of the compliment. You know, that compliment, oh, these are so good, you should go into business. Well, some people take it serious. So I approached him in 2005 to do a process analysis as part of an operations project for class. I was finishing up my MBA at Westminster and chose, my father had received his chocolates as a gift for years. And so I thought I'd reach out to him and do an analysis on that. I figured it would be a good one to analyze, plus I could probably get some free chocolate out of it. So at the time, it was still just he and his wife. So the project turned into a consulting and then into a partnership. And ultimately, we grew the company to 65 employees and international distribution before I sold my shares in 2013. So a little bit of background, now to the supply chain illustration. So there are a number of resources that go into the production of chocolates, including the ingredients, packaging, labor, and energy. Each of these resources has its own progression from being a resource to going to the end consumer. So chocolate was by far the largest volume and most important ingredient we put into our products. So we'll look at the chocolate supply chain, specifically as it related to Utah Truffles. So let's start at the very beginning. Virtually all physical resources start at a point in which they are grown, dug, or killed. In the case of chocolate, it's grown. Chocolate comes from fruit of the cacao tree. These pods are colorful, leathery, and shaped a bit like a football. The fruit is then harvested and left to ferment and dry. The dried cacao or cocoa is bagged and sold on the cocoa market. In the case of Utah Truffles, the cocoa is purchased by Barry Callebaut and transported to Belgium to be roasted, ground, and processed into chocolate liqueur. The liqueur is then transported to the U.S., combined with other ingredients like sugar, milk, vanilla, and other items, and processed into 10-pound blocks of chocolate. Each of these other ingredients has its own supply chain. Those blocks of chocolate are then sent to Utah Truffles production facility in Utah and melted down. The melted chocolate is again combined with other ingredients like coconut oil, flavoring, and nuts, and processed into chocolate bars and chocolate bites. These are packaged and then sent to distributors. The distributors break down the pallets of chocolate and combine the boxes with other items and deliver the products to the retailers. The retailers display and promote the products, and then it's purchased and consumed by the consumers. This process combines resources from around the globe. The beauty of the supply chain is that after all the distance traveled and the various organizations processing and adding value to the product, the consumer is able to purchase that chocolate bar for about $1 an ounce. Each one of the organizations made profits along the way, and yet the consumer is able to get the product for a fraction of the price that they would pay if they were to try and produce the product themselves from scratch. There are producers, even locally, that cut out the middlemen in the chocolate supply chain. They are boutique producers that are often referred to as bean-to-bar producers. They typically buy the dried beans and do all of the steps from bee to direct sales to the consumers, and yet the consumer will pay 8 to 15 times as much. So why is that? Isn't the producer saving money by cutting out the middlemen? This is an interesting aspect of supply chains. Longer, more complex supply chains often are able to get the products to the consumer for cheaper than shorter supply chains. Why is this? So there are two primary things that account for this. First, economies of scale, and second, specialization. So let's look at economies of scale first. Economies of scale are the cost advantages that enterprises obtain due to their scale of operation. In the case of chocolate, the scale gives advantage on price of the beans. So the buyer purchasing over 200,000 tons of cocoa per year will get a much better price than the buyer purchasing 5,000 tons, which is still a lot of cocoa. The larger organization will also get better per ton shipping prices and will have priority on the supply at that price. So higher volumes also tend to lead to increased automation, which in turn decreases production costs. Second one, specialization. So specialization allows for producers to streamline their operations and become increasingly efficient through consistent processes. Organizations that shorten the supply chain have to manage all of these processes that were cut out themselves. In Module 1, we discussed the importance of strategy and effectively developing a strategy through internal and external scanning. The strategy developed from this process plays a critical role in understanding and development of an effective supply chain that supports both the creation of value and as a response to four primary external competitive pressures. These pressures are dynamic sales volume, customer service and quality expectations, good or service proliferation, and emerging and global markets. It is critical that the strategy is developed and understood at the enterprise level. The strategy should be a collaboration and should be agreed upon across functions, including sales, marketing, operations, and finance. Failure to do so will lead to organizational conflict and a breakdown in culture. Let's take a closer look at each of these pressures. So one of the most challenging and persistent problems faced by an operations is meeting the volatility of sales volumes. The dynamic nature of external demand has a direct effect on the internal demand of an organization's resources. It often leads to excess inventories, underutilized personnel, and increased logistical costs. This volatility is not limited to external factors. Internally, these issues may be triggered by other functions within the organization. For example, sales and marketing may trigger a spike in demand by heavy end-of-month discounts and promotions in order to meet sales goals. So chocolate sales are an example of a product that's extremely seasonal and demand is prone to wild fluctuations. This is one of the primary challenges that my business partner was dealing with in the early years of his business. He produced boxed chocolates, and consumers mostly buy boxed chocolates as gifts, not for personal consumption. For this reason, his business was extremely busy and profitable during October, November, December, January, February, and May, Mother's Day and May. In fact, a side note, we found that people bought more expensive chocolate for Mother's Day than they did for Valentine's Day. So, the other 6 months, however, were just the opposite. Chocolate sales in general drop in June, July, and August. Boxed chocolate sales during these months disappear almost entirely. The challenge is that the leases and salaries and other expenses are still due, even when there are no revenues. The facility and resources required to meet the demand during the busy months were sucking the company dry during the slow months. So once we recognize this, we need to develop a strategy to deal with it. And I love Jeff Bezos' quote that says, where he once said, success requires a strategy and complaining is not a strategy. So we looked at our resources that we had available and we tried to understand the consumer's behavior. We decided to lengthen our chocolates and adjust our pillow wrapper to make chocolate truffle candy bars. So it was the exact same chocolate that we sold in the gift boxes, but in a form that consumers were more likely to consume themselves and that didn't require a holiday or a special occasion to get them to buy. The goal was for the truffle candy bar to generate enough revenue during the slower months to allow us to break even. Ultimately, the truffle candy bar became over 70% of our annual revenue and became the product most familiar to the consumers. So a shift in our strategy, recognizing the pain points that were causing this wild fluctuation that was really challenging our operations, we changed the strategy and we did an external scan to look at what the opportunity was. And because of that, our operations became much smoother as we were able to iron out those wild fluctuations with this new product. So, likewise, pressures come from the expected level of quality and service by the customers. Again, Other functions within the organization may have a direct impact on establishing the expected level of quality. So operations, sales, marketing, and finance should collaborate on this in order to understand the levels of quality and service that are expected, if they are achievable, and at what cost. These decisions have a direct effect on the design of the supply chain and choice of suppliers. It is also critical to understand and agree upon how pervasive the good or service is intended to be. So because of their proximity to the customers, sales and marketing typically create the pressure to drive new products and extend existing lines. But without collaborative strategy, this often leads to SKU creep and a circumstance in which a large portion of SKUs contribute only a small percentage of revenues. This is compounded by increased inventory, production, changeover costs, and delivery costs. A thoughtful balance needs to be maintained between the cost of operating and the pressures to create new goods and services. And then lastly, the approach to emerging and global markets needs to be addressed in the organizational strategy. In many ways, the world is getting smaller. Thomas Friedman, in his book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, which was written about 20 years ago, but still quite relevant for today, proposes that the shrinking of the world is driven by three things: the democratization of communication, the democratization of technology, and the democratization of finance. Increased global access to these three things makes it easier to produce and sell products all over the world. Increased access to resources and marketplaces makes it critical to understand these dynamics in order to take advantage of opportunities and avoid failures. It's critical to understand the global economy and expanding markets, even if the firm does not have any intentions of expansion into these markets. They still have a direct effect on the company. Going back to 2006 and 2007, Utah Truffles was growing quite rapidly. Even so, we were a small company, even at a regional scale, let alone a global or national scale. I spent very little time thinking about larger markets. Toward the end of 2006, our volumes were growing, and we were working with our chocolate supplier on pricing. There are two basic options when it comes to buying chocolate. We could continue to purchase at the street price, which is the non-contract price. So we get a discount based on historical volume and the order size, but the price is adjusted at each order to reflect the current market prices. Or we could contract in a price for 18 months and be guaranteed that price. The contract price was about 5% higher than the street price. We decided to go with the contract price. The logic was this: I would rather have a stable price for 18 months on my primary ingredient than bet the market. Additionally, I felt that there was a lot more room for the prices to rise versus fall. So for a few months, we were paying 3 to 7% more for chocolate than if we had not contracted. But then there was a challenge to an election in the Ivory Coast, and everything changed. Before that time, I could not have pointed out the Ivory Coast on a map. I knew it was somewhere in West Africa. What I didn't know was that 40% of the world's supply of chocolate comes from the Ivory Coast. The country was now in turmoil and headed towards severe internal strife. As a result, all exports of cocoa were halted from the country, cutting off a major supply. Within months, the market price of chocolate surged more than 30%. We were now fortunate to be in a stable contract at a much lower price. Had we not, the surge would likely have wiped the company out at that sensitive time. An election in a small African country had a direct effect on a small chocolate company halfway around the world. From that point on, I began to spend a lot more attention on my entire supply chain. So in their text, Operations Management, Process and Supply Chains, Krajewski, Malhotra, and Ritzman, I hope I said those names right, stated that the design of an effective supply chain must be a collaborative effort from the CEO on down if it's to meet these four pressures we just discussed. All functional areas have a stake in the organization's supply chains. The firm's operations strategy and competitive priorities guide its supply chain choices. This Venn diagram illustrates how these things come together and why it's important to look at the interplay between service and product, and then the processes, and then the supply chain. So we talked a little bit about processes and processes supporting the service, the production of the good or the service. And that's an important thing to consider and look at the link between the services and products with the internal processes. But we also have to be aware of the external, and that's the supply chains. So how do we link those services and products with the external supply? So the competitive priorities assigned to the firm's services or products must be reflected in the design of the network of the suppliers. And that third one is linking the services or products with the customers, suppliers, and the supply chain. Getting that point where all of those things are working together. So the firm's processes that enable it to develop what the customer wants, interact with the suppliers, deliver services or products, interact with consumers, address environmental and ethical issues, and provide the informational and planning tools needed to execute the operation strategy are the glue that binds an effective supply chain. So understanding these pressures and creating a strategy that magnifies the strengths of the company is a critical step in creating an effective supply chain design. The supply chain design is the blueprint for organizing the supply chain to meet the competitive priorities of the operation strategy. Without a supply chain design, the organization is forced to be reactionary, leading to increased risk of wasted resources and missed opportunities.